episode features a live recording from the April 2026 Docs with Disabilities panel titled Evidence to Action, held at the International Congress on Academic Medicine in Ottawa, Canada. This session brought together a powerful panel of physician leaders, educators, and advocates working across undergraduate and postgraduate medical education to move disability inclusion from theory to practice. Together, they explore what it takes to translate research into real-world change through policy, culture, training, and systems design. From building new institutional frameworks to rethinking accommodations as part of long-term professional success, this conversation pushes us to consider not just what we know, but what we do with that knowledge. Now, on to the panel.
Welcome. How many of you have been with us in the last 2 years? Wonderful, wonderful. And so we have lots of new people. Thank you so much for coming to hear this live session. If you don't know where you are and you just accidentally stumbled up the escalator, you are now in a live session of the Docs with Disabilities podcast. And we're really, really glad that you are here, whether you're joining us here in the room at ICAM or accessing this after the event. It is an honor to be invited back by ICAM. And so I want to start by thanking all of our Canadian friends and colleagues from the AFMC for this incredible opportunity. And thank you, the audience, for giving us your time. Time is the greatest gift we have to give to one another. So you spending time here with us in this conversation is really important, and I appreciate it. I also want to note that I am so grateful personally for the Canadian researchers and clinicians who are making incredible contributions to the literature and building support systems for disabled trainees and clinicians, many of them on our panel today. Whenever I'm looking for something that is absolutely incredible to cite in my work, I merely look up to the Canadian literature, and the options are endless.
So before we begin, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge that this building is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin people. We acknowledge those who came before us and honor those who are the caretakers of this land and water. As such, we are guests on this space, and it is our shared responsibility to respect, honor, and sustain this land.
Thank you, Lynn. So my name is Lisa Meeks. I'm a professor of medical education at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I also hold an appointment in family medicine at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I'm the founder and the executive director of Docs with Disabilities and of this podcast. This podcast has become a multi-layered space where we highlight the personal stories of physicians and nurses, healthcare providers that share their experiences in the hopes of providing asynchronous mentoring to individuals who want to come into the profession, and also hopefully to faculty and administrators that are listening who want to make change in their institutions. Oftentimes, we'll also have special thematic issues like this one on research or systems change. And today's conversation is really part of that goal. So our title today of this episode is Evidence to Action. And that was a very intentional title. We now, across many, many countries, have strong data, national reports, and a growing body of scholarship on disability inclusion in health professions education. And we're moving from this mere awareness and baseline data into talking about how you make actionable change. What do you need to do to catalyze your institutions? Lynn?
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be co-hosting and co-moderating with Lisa Meeks. My name is Lynn Ashdown. I am MD trained, but due to life-altering injuries, I'm now a medical educator, patient partner, and disability advocate. I'm excited to co-host this session. As Lisa mentioned, we are moving to focus on how medical schools, residency programs, and institutions are translating research into updated policies, new programs, and reimagined support structures for learners and physicians with disabilities. We're entering a new era in health professions education. We're recognizing the tremendous value that health professionals with lived experience with disability, in addition to more disability education and an anti-ableist approach to health professional education, adds value to patient care and helps to reduce healthcare disparities while diversifying the workforce. We'll be talking honestly about what it takes to embed accessibility into educational environments and how accountability, leadership, and culture determine whether those efforts last. Our panelists today bring perspectives from undergraduate and postgraduate medical education, faculty affairs, institutional leadership, and lived experience. By the end of this conversation, our hope is that you'll leave with practical insights and strategies you can adopt within your own institution. So, let's get started by meeting our panel.
Hi, my name is Camille Monroe. I'm a palliative medicine physician in the Department of Medicine at the University of Ottawa and the Ottawa Hospital, and I'm passionate about my work caring for patients and families who face a serious illness. Alongside my clinical role, I'm a strong advocate for disability inclusion in medicine. I've published work on implementing a formal accommodations policy for physicians with disabilities. My interest is in practical change, policies and cultures that allow physicians with disabilities to thrive and fully contribute while strengthening patient care.
Hi there. I'm Jill Rutkowski. I'm an academic physician at McMaster University. I'm trained in critical care medicine and I live with chronic disability. I'm currently working within resident affairs, where I have helped to develop the accommodations policy, and I continue to work to support the process and implementation. I've had the privilege of working with Lisa and the team on the US ACGME Disability Policy Toolkit. And prior to this, I'd say I sort of cut my teeth, so to speak, working as the McMaster Chair of Clerkship, where one of my key roles was to ensure that communication and implementation of accommodations was successful for clerks in the clerkship setting. I have also held leadership roles nationally in undergraduate and CME accreditation and locally at St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton. I am truly grateful for all of the opportunities I have to advocate for trainees and physicians with disabilities, particularly to challenge the culture of ableism and seek greater accessibility for everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pamela Liao. I intended to be a surgeon, but have ended up as a family physician practicing in palliative care and care of the elderly. Through my lived experience and early conversations with Lisa Meeks many, many years ago, I entered this space involved with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities, doing advocacy work as well as scholarship. And that led me to become the first disability health lead of a medical school. So I'm now based at Toronto Metropolitan University, where I've spent the last 2 years as the disability health lead. And just this week, accepted a position as Associate Dean, Accessibility and Disability Health, the first role of its kind in Canada, which is really a testament to the work that everyone in this room has been doing. In addition to the work that I'm doing at TMU, the AFMC has committed to the development of what's called a Disability Inclusion Network. And I'm proud to share that we had our first in-person session just leading this. And I acknowledge all of those in the room who were participants to share their wisdom, their strengths, their vulnerabilities. And I hope we can do more of that here today. So thank you for having me on the podcast.
My name is Samantha Levitt. I'm a disabled family physician and the first Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion curricular lead in undergraduate medical education at the University of Ottawa. While my job description is based in curriculum, I embrace this role as a launching point for modeling accessibility initiatives in the academic space at the faculty. And I'm pleased to support my colleagues as well through dedicated peer support groups for family doctors with chronic illness and disabilities, which I established at the Ontario College of Family Physicians, and through individual coaching on living and working with disability in medicine. I also advocate for practicing physicians with disabilities and systems change as an educator, performing conference presentations, such as this one, to broaden understanding of accommodations and open the imagination to what healthcare systems can look like when they are accessible to everyone, patients and healthcare providers alike.
Thank you all so much. I've had the pleasure of working with this panel for the last 6 months, and they are incredible. So we're going to have a lovely conversation today. I'm going to start with Camille. Camille, you've been deeply involved in developing and refining formal accommodation policies for physicians. Why does centralizing the process matter so much? And what happens when accommodations are handled informally or division by division?
So that's a really important question, Lisa. Centralization matters because equity should not depend on geography or personality. When accommodations are handled division by division or department by department, outcomes vary widely based on a leader's experience, their comfort level, or local culture. And that variability creates inequity and uncertainties, even within the same institution. Informal processes rely on goodwill rather than structure. And while goodwill is important, it's not enough. Without a centralized, transparent process, we risk unintentionally excluding skilled and capable physicians. And also, physicians are left navigating very highly personal disclosures in environments that may or may not feel safe. So what we do know is that many physicians quietly self-accommodate instead of formally requesting support. And that silence is not a sign that the system is working, but rather it's often a sign that it isn't trusted. So centralization brings consistency, confidentiality, and clarity. It signals accommodation is a professional process, not a favor, not a negotiation, and not dependent on who your division or department head happens to be. And leaders play a very crucial role modeling that normalization.
Thank you. Yeah, this aligns so much with the qualitative research from Canada as well, where it really does rely on the goodwill of one individual. And so much of the disability work, certainly at the beginning, was driven by people that had family members with disabilities or had disability themselves, or really were incredible advocates for disability inclusion. And that's wonderful until that person leaves. And we don't want a system's accessibility to be dependent on one person. Jill, you've been intimately involved in this research, both in the Canadian context and in the US context. Can you chime in and talk about what you've seen with relation to what Camille is saying?
Thanks, Lisa. I fully agree with Camille that one of the big challenges we're facing at the moment is that sometimes there's a tendency to create a policy and then just put a tick mark. Oh, we've done it. We've made a policy, and then walk away from that. Whereas within all of these medical education programs, universities and hospitals, there's a huge lack of consistency. And this is true in Canada and the US. And I think that the real issue is there is a lack of understanding of the essential duty to accommodate, both at the highest levels of leadership and also with the people that are tasked with ensuring that the policies are implemented. So having the policy itself is not enough. So this ultimately results in policies that might look, sort of in quotes, okay on paper, but they leave the person navigating them facing a difficult situation and trying to figure out the process for themselves. So I think for myself, this has really led me to understand that we need clear and succinct toolkits for every level, UGME, PGME, practicing physicians, so that we can ensure there is a common understanding of the key aspects of the policies and to make sure that they're literally user-friendly and implementable.
Camille, in your paper, you talk about this. What are the barriers to something like what Jill's talking about?
I believe there are several layered barriers. The first, stigma is real. Many physicians worry about being perceived as less capable, less resilient, or less promotable. That fear drives underreporting and self-accommodation. Second, leaders are often not trained on how to have conversations around disability or how to apply the accommodations policy into practice. So even if a policy exists, there may or may not be any clear guidance or practical tools on how to implement it effectively. That creates anxiety on both sides of the conversation. Third, accommodations are too often framed around a physician's disability rather than their abilities and contributions. When the focus is on perceived deficits rather than strengths, then disclosure feels risky. There's also frequently no designated neutral person who can support both the leader and the physician. Someone who can ensure that the process is fair, consistent, and that there's clarity. Without that, the conversation feels very personal and very isolating rather than a procedural conversation. And finally, confidentiality concerns are significant. If a physician is unsure who will know how the information will be stored or how it will affect their evaluations or advancement, then they understandably are reluctant to disclose.
Jill, how do your experiences align with what Camille's saying?
I think Camille's point around the need for a neutral individual to support the person seeking accommodation and to support the program leaders and people within the programs that are helping with implementation is so important. In Canada, our undergraduate medical trainees are more likely than our postgraduate trainees or practicing physicians to have access to a designated disability support provider through their university. Postgraduate medical trainees in Canada are both learners and employees. So each university has to determine who has the knowledge and training to support them, and there is no standardized approach at the moment. When it comes to practicing physicians, it's even more complicated. Many practicing physicians have affiliations with both universities and hospital or community centers, or they're in practice only in the community without an overarching organization with an infrastructure. So one would think that academic physicians would have access to more supports through universities, but this is not the case. This issue of continuity has not been systematically addressed across the lifespan of the physician and really needs a unifying approach.
So we're going to pivot just a little bit, and I'm going to talk to you, Pam. So you entered in a very different context, building systems at a new medical school. Can you take us through how you approached aligning undergraduate, postgraduate, faculty, and applicants under a shared disability inclusion framework?
Thank you for the question, Lynn. Historically, systems around disability inclusion and accommodations accessibility have been built up over time, whereas this was an opportunity to really look from a brand new lens. Often, the conversation has focused on learners and on accommodations. This was an opportunity to take a step back and look from an anti-ableist lens across the entire institution in the infrastructure as it was being built. Until now, disability inclusion, social justice, advocacy, admissions, accommodations have lived across multiple portfolios and, may I even say, silos across institutions. A faculty lead, for example, may be involved in disability-related curriculum, but their work is entirely separate from that to do with admissions or faculty recruitment. And then faculty development and promotions live in an entirely different space from those as well. So in my role, I had the opportunity to really look across the continuum. An example I wanted to share is in Canada, we recognize the National Accessibility Week at the end of May each year. And in my role, I was able to host a series of events throughout the school that touched on each aspects. In our first year, of course, we didn't have learners. So the focus was really on preparing new faculty, on culturalizing them with the school and our EDI principles and values, but preparing them to welcome learners. And this year, we'll also launch the Ability Collective, which is a learner-led group advocating for accessibility and disability inclusion. And so really pulling in from all aspects of the school in a united front to say that this is an important value of ours, and it's not just talk and theory, but day-to-day practice in what we do.
So I'm going to just ask a little bit of a follow-up. So what role did co-creation and senior leadership support play in developing all of these policies?
Nothing would have been possible without partnership. The role that I have cross-cuts the entire school. And so that's not work you can do alone by any means. Having a common understanding was critical. And that was the early days of my work, was really trying to understand every portfolio's perspective, their priorities, the incredibly unforgiving timelines they were working with, because we were in the midst of accommodations, recruiting learners, and building processes all at the same time. I think what was important is, though, our school is really grounded in commitment to EDI work. And so in terms of the development of our school, the first piece to go out was the proposal for the school. The second was an entire report outlining our commitments to EDI work. And that the kind of phrase we use is that EDI is built into the bricks of our school. And while that's in principle something we all understood, how that translated for each portfolio and what it meant to be inclusive, accessible, to be aware of disability in a meaningful way took work. It took work to understand candidates with certain types of disabilities could absolutely apply to our medical school, and we absolutely will be providing a holistic accommodations experience for them. before they're even admitted, for example. So having safe spaces to have conversations like that, for people to ask questions that might not feel comfortable, to how are we really going to do this, was really the important work of building trust amongst all the different portfolios in our school. Another example is that we have a foundational curriculum for our senior leadership team and faculty. And in the first few years, we were small enough, we actually all used to get together and do that learning together as faculty and staff. So not only was it talking about themes, but also relaying it back to the work of our individual portfolios. Now our school no longer fits in one little camera photo, which is really exciting. But actually my colleague, who is our Associate Dean of Equity and Social Accountability, in collaboration with the rest of our community culture and belonging team, has launched the EDI Lenses program, which is a comprehensive mandatory core curriculum for our faculty and staff, so that we all come from the same kind of common language to then tackle these broader issues in EDI.
So what I'm hearing is that policies create permission, but it's really the culture that actually enacts and not enforces, but is the reason why it's woven into the framework of the entire university.
Exactly.
Pam, I'm so curious. The accountability of making it mandatory is so novel, where there's other areas where discrimination can occur and there are mandatory trainings. There's really no system that I know of in the US that has a mandatory training around disability. And even while we're actively creating and getting ready to launch them, we don't know who will engage with them. So that is so needed. And thank you so much for that work. Sam, I'm going to go to you, if that's okay. In developing this panel, you talked a lot about how if we wanted meaningful change in UME, we really had to start with how we treat our physicians with disabilities and change that culture and that lens. Can you unpack that for us a little bit more?
Absolutely. I'm actually so excited about what they're doing at TMU. I didn't know that your accessibility training was mandatory. So I'm actually really excited about that too, because we do have accessibility training in Ontario that's mandatory, but it's not mandatory for education. It's like one of the standards that's missing. So in most institutions, what we're working in is the existing hierarchical structure of medicine, which is based in this patriarchal system of intersecting oppressions that is historically dehumanizing to non-disabled people and just absolutely riddled with barriers for people who identify as disabled or chronically ill. And this culture of medicine is the one that wants you to pride yourself on not going to the bathroom or not eating for prolonged periods of time or not sleeping while you continue to see patients all night, and denying your body those necessary needs is what tells others that you're working really hard and that you're doing such a good job being a doctor, right? For many people, that self-sacrifice is what it means to be a physician. And that ingrained belief is the baseline for so many of our faculty members. So the reason that changing physician culture becomes so important is that when we look at the medical student experience and the influences that our students receive in developing their own beliefs about physician identity and what expressions of their own needs are acceptable, these physicians with that baseline belief are everywhere in our education. So these physicians are making up our small group leaders, our mentors, our lecturers, our clinical supervisors, rotation supervisors, and our faculty leadership. So if the physicians in our faculty are not on board with disability inclusion in a meaningful way, we're still honoring this belief of self-sacrifice and like physical denial of biological needs as a necessary part of identity, then our students are not going to feel safe reaching for the supports they need to be appropriately accommodated. And in an environment where this physician culture is so overwhelmingly dominant, they really don't have anyone else to turn to. We need to be able to face the reality of our mortal bodies and acknowledge that meeting those needs does not make us less qualified or competent. But until that culture changes, it's our responsibility as academic leaders to ensure that the accommodation system we have in place is actually working. So we evaluate the student experience for approachability, like we talked about safe disclosures, and effectiveness, but we also evaluate it from the teacher side, like you talked about training faculty. Do they know how the system works? And if the teachers haven't been trained on accommodations, there is a real risk of discrimination and harm for our students.
That's such a good point. When we started this podcast, one of the things we talked about was the counter narrative. We have to normalize this. These systems and structures are so deeply embedded, this sleep when you can, eat when you can, the superpower to be able to stay up all night. People brag about it. No one should do that. But you're right, it's so deeply ingrained in our system. And so when you have a disability and you have a need, it's seen as just abnormal. Camille and Jill talk about the structures and the policies needed to drive systems change. And then, of course, Pam with her brand new school and all these bells and whistles is talking about how they're really focused on culture because she knows that policy is not going to cut it. You can have a policy and people still won't buy in, right? So you're talking about training and you're talking about a different level of training. And you know, this is my soapbox too. Tell us more about why we need, sorry to push you, but tell us more about why we need this training and why accommodation should be normalized.
When you look particularly the Government of Canada definition of accommodations, it's not actually restricted to medical or health reasons, right? So that is one thing I like to normalize about accommodations, is that it's just having a need that needs to be addressed. So that's one thing I like to open up the conversation. We all have accommodations. There's loads of other accommodations that we don't consider to be extra or like special in any way. But for some reason, when it's medical or health related, like, oh, it's a big hullabaloo now. So that's one thing I like to normalize. When we hire medical teachers, we hire them based on their clinical experience. And so there's no requirement to learn about accommodations. And so the accommodation system, as we arrange it in our school, is completely separated from the preceptors. And that's for student confidentiality. But it means that when the system fails, there's such a large gap that if the teacher is not trained, then they have no idea what to do next. But in that moment that the system fails, it's ultimately the preceptor and the student who need to negotiate a solution. That day, that hour, they need to figure something out. And that's why the training is so important. So if we're not teaching them how to manage these situations and problem solve as part of faculty onboarding and development, we really don't know what's happening until it's too late. So it's one thing to be in a state of compliance where, like, yes, we've set up these policies, we've set up these rules, we have teachers who are aware of them, they know the rules because they have to follow them. But it's an entirely different concept to be in a state of support and acceptance where the teachers have been trained, they understand why it's important and meaningful, and a student can identify a faculty member as someone who understands the system and is willing to participate in it and support them because they know that faculty member believes it's the right thing to do and not just because they have to. And training is a crucial part of developing that foundation. So when the teachers can meaningfully participate in that way, the learners then receive the message, whether they identify as disabled or not, they carry that message forward to their learners because we work in an apprenticeship style profession, right? And as they move across health systems and academic institutions, that change then can get spread in a generational and regional manner. And eventually we improve working conditions for everyone.
Yeah. We want to understand. It seems like a black box. We get this letter, we're told what to do, and we're told not to talk about it, right? So now we've taken something where we're trying to change culture, but we've made it scary for the leader, for the faculty, for the preceptors. I think your example is perfect. Something goes wrong. It always will. Even with the best systems, we will have things where we need to be a little bit more nimble. And in that moment, if the preceptor's in a system where it's like, do not talk to the student, do not bring up the disability, do not do this, the preceptor's frozen. What do I do? What do I say? What do I not say? I know there's a legal consequence to this. And yet, despite the legal consequence, we're not training people, certainly not mandatory, and we don't have people making the decisions that understand medical education and or the law. So it's a complicated balancing act. It really is. Any other thoughts?
I think you're so right in that the conversation, which needs to be broader than accommodations, I will just start by saying, is that accommodations is not a one-way street. And so often that's how it's treated. The discourse is sort of from the learner or resident affairs office with the learner, maybe the accommodation central office. The sort of pinnacle of this pathway is the letter, but the interpretation of that letter in a clinical context, the interpretation of that letter, wherever that learner may be on that day with their symptoms, with whatever space they're in, is so much more the part of the journey, and it is truly the devil in the details. And when you can fix little things, sometimes it makes the whole plan sing. But like you said, it's not something, those things you can't always plan for. And so I think it's really building that comfort level and that awareness, because I don't get the sense from many faculty that they're against these plans. And same with the work I've done, with across the school. No one's against these principles, but it's how do we actually do it? Hold my hand, walk me through it. And often it's a journey together. I'm not an expert in so many things, but it's that commitment to, we're going to do it. We're going to commit to doing it. We're going to goof up. And that is known and part of the process. And it's that willingness to be vulnerable and actually just go deep end in.
Thank you. So you talked about building and educating great doctors. I love how when all of you can contextualize this work, you're not just talking about what do we do for medical students. How does that change or impact your ideas about accommodation or policy?
We talk about this all the time when we're planning curriculum, about shifting from a knowledge-based system to a competency-based system, right? We haven't done that with accommodations. Our students currently are on a rotation-based system. And for their preclinical years, this usually works out okay because their accommodations don't change much between rotations. But as they prepare for clerkship, the access to accommodations becomes another barrier in their education because each rotation's accommodations have to be approved weeks in advance from the main campus. And then it goes through a chain of approval and communications down to the site coordinator and the supervisors and before it ultimately reaches its final destination. And there's so many places in that chain for it to completely fall apart. And ultimately, it's the students who have to deal with it on top of doing everything else while they're in their current clinical rotation, preparing for the next one and the next one, the next one, right? If for whatever reason, the accommodations aren't ready for the first week of that rotation, it usually can't be fixed by the time they finish that rotation because it's all this bureaucratic back and forth. And so what happens is if they physically can, they will push through. And it contributes to this like boom bust or crash cycle in which they're temporarily exceeding the limits of what is healthy for their condition to meet the requirements of their rotation, because what else are they going to do, right? But it's not a healthy pattern to set up long term, and it puts them at a disadvantage for the next rotation start. And if they can hold on that long, right? So if we want to truly support our students, we should be preparing them for long-term management. So we can conduct an assessment at the beginning of their education, even before they start. We can look at the possible learning environments they're going to be in. We know what they are. We know generally what rotations they're going to take. We know what activities that may entail. We know what facilities are connected to our institution at that time. And we can determine a set of flexible accommodations for different learning environments or activities so that they do this one big assessment at the beginning, get their paperwork in order then, and then we can just do little adjustments as needed. If you have a medical update, little tweak, right? You don't reevaluate them every 4 weeks.
It's a really big burden, too, to ask learners to come in every 4 weeks. That's just so time intensive. And you're right. You know what's going to happen. So you can do a lot of prediction if you know medical education. So there, we're getting back to the if you if you understand what's happening and the learner can describe their functional limitations, then you can start to predict what may be needed.
So this next question is for all of the panelists. And I want to ask each of you to touch on how continuity and long-term thinking beyond individual rotations can change outcomes for disabled learners and physicians.
At the individual level, really focusing on seamless transitions as we have candidates who become pre-clerkship learners, who become clerks, who become residents, who become faculty. We know, as Samantha said, that these changes are going to happen. And I think so often right now, those transition points are really a struggle. Administrative burden is used a lot, but I think really falls to the bearer of those with disabilities, having to have all the paperwork organized, having to meet with the accommodations office, showing up on a rotation and no one has any clue that the schedule was supposed to be a certain way. That administrative burden is something I've experienced. It's almost like not only are you a medical student, but you have this other part-time job in addition to living with your illness. And so I think whatever we can do from a system level to reduce that friction, I think is really vital. I think the other piece that's a really key step is having faculty who understand those learners. So it's not just a one-way street, but it's having leaders seeing faculty with disabilities, making it very signaling that this is a place where you belong. As a senior leader, I'm not always just looking at the one individual scenario, which of course is important, but how do we build systems and processes that are transition proof? It was mentioned earlier, when you have a champion who leaves, it can be devastating to a department or to a division or a program. And so how can you build processes that are foolproof so that no matter who is in the role, because we all turn over at some point, how can we build processes and policies that keep people safe and keep things intact? Building capacity in the space is so important because you can't just have one set of people doing things. How can we build in junior roles or maybe lead roles? You don't walk into these senior level positions, but you've had the chance to over time be prepared for those. So I think those are some small tangible ways that we need to think about in terms of getting new leaders into this space.
Jill, go ahead.
I want to continue along this idea of accessibility. And to me, accessibility is what happens when you have universal design. So it's the curb cut effect. The curb cut was built for the person who ambulates with a wheelchair, but all of us who've walked with a cane, pushed a stroller, had a shopping cart, benefited, right? So to everyone in the room who has a leadership position is really to think about what policy changes are under your mandate that you can make to increase accessibility in your clinical learning environments. This can start simply within your own individual sphere of influence. If you're the educational site lead at a hospital, have you ensured that there are wheelchair accessible call rooms, that these are close to accessible bathrooms, that all call rooms have computers in them, that all learners have access to voice to text capabilities of the EMR? These are things that many learners, not just those that might need accommodation, would benefit from. And therefore, when a learner who, for example, needs voice to text comes into your environment and voice to text is available to everybody, they don't need an accommodation. There is no administrative burden. It's just there for the taking for whoever might need it on that given day or whoever might find that helpful. And so we have to start digging a little bit deeper in our own sphere of influence and think about the things that are right in front of us that we can do to allow for universal design and accessibility.
I'm just reflecting on the long-term planning that we do in the other respects for our students. We host seminars for careers in specialty choices. We think about training them on how to manage their finances. We do all kinds of well-being supports. We teach them meditation. We do so many other aspects of their life that we consider long-term planning, except this one. And I just think we need to stop treating this aspect like it's an optional part of that plan.
Thank you. I was thinking, Sam, about what you said about this is the one context where we don't think about planning and long-term supports. We also don't think about QI. We don't look at our accommodations processes. So this is something that we need to start thinking about. Jill, I did want to ask you one follow-up question. As I mentioned, you've worked on all of this from in both contexts, US and Canada. From your perspective, what makes implementation of these policies succeed or fail? Because again, I can give you a policy that you can copy. In your context, is it going to work? What makes it succeed or fail?
Thanks, Lisa. I'm going to touch on sort of two key areas. One of the main things is that for people who are writing the policies to consider and understand the issues that face the people impacted by the policy. And in that, I mean two main groups. So first, that's collaboration and consultation with the people with lived experience who need the policy. So they must be included in the conversation at every level. And second, you need to speak to the people who are charged with implementing the policy. Because if your policy doesn't make any sense on the ground, it's not going to be implemented correctly. So it has to be pragmatic at the end of the day. And policies that kind of sit up there in the stratosphere and don't feel tangible to the people who need them or the people who implement them are bound to fail. So I think that policy guidelines and toolkits are really essential there because they can help to guide people towards the key elements that meet that pragmatic lens. It's critical that policies around accommodation for disability don't inadvertently work against the goal of increasing accessibility. Policies can't be overly generic in that they must consider the specific context of a trainee or physician in a given learning and clinical environment, because when they are overly generic, they tend to not meet the needs of anyone. And again, it's that ticky box phenomenon. Oh, I did it. I had a policy. I gave accommodations next. But if that accommodation doesn't help that learner meet their competencies and overcome their functional limitation, then why is it even there? And then finally, I think that the point that has only recently started to be talked about and is really critical to this is the language of accommodation. I think that the language of accommodation is absolutely critical to ensure that the policy and process are translated into something that's implementable and serve the purpose for what they were designed. Using language that does not fit the learning or working environment contributes to policy failure. And said in plain words, that's the preceptor who receives the accommodation, reads it 6 times and goes, I have no idea what this means. What should happen is that preceptor should receive the accommodation and go, what? Of course. Yeah, okay. Doctors Dani and Meeks and their team recently wrote about the importance of language of accommodation in undergraduate medical education and academic medicine. And I encourage people to look at that because I think that this is just the beginning of a discussion in a very critical area. What I also want to say with that is it does not mean that we should just have a drop-down list of accommodations for specific functional limitations. That can be helpful, but again needs to be context specific to the individual and to the learning environment. So we have to be cautious there. But at the same time, exploring those approaches and understanding what works when it works, take a bit of a resilience engineering approach and say, okay, let's just road test this. We have a lot of learners who need an accommodation for rest in a quiet space in the middle of the day, which isn't exactly natural in an acute inpatient environment. So let's road test how we would give that information to a bunch of preceptors and see if they get it or they don't get it. And if they don't get it, maybe we just need to reframe the language and ask them, what would make sense to you that we could get this across to you? Because then we will be better and it will be more efficient and more effective and decrease the administrative burden and let us spend the time where we need to spend the time and make sure that the policies are implemented in the way they were intended.
I'd love each and every one of you to end with one sentence. And that is, what's the single most important action institutions should take to move disability inclusion forward? And Camille, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so the single most important action, from my experience, I feel, is to centralize and professionalize accommodations, providing clear policies, leadership training and education, and consistent and sustained support. So requesting accommodations is safe, equitable, and normalized rather than a personal risk.
Jill.
So I would follow that by saying we have to continue to counter the prevalent ableist attitudes. Part of this is looking at accessibility in our physical, digital environments, the ways people work and contribute to the system, the ways we learn and contribute to the system, so that there's less need for individualized accommodation when there is exceptional accessibility. And in the meantime, we need to find ways to provide accommodations that are more collaborative, more consistent, and less burdensome to the folks that need them.
I will address the people that make up the institutions and say that trying to address accessibility and inclusion on an institution level can feel really overwhelming, particularly if you don't already have a structure in place with which to do so. So just start where you are and have that first conversation to get going and get help making change.
So we've been talking at this meeting a lot about social accountability and equity, diversity, and inclusion. And what I would say is it's time that we just expect there are people with disabilities at every stage of what we do and work with that assumption in place.
Love that. Great way to end. Thank you all so much. Can we get a round of applause? They can fill this big room. Thank you so much.
I want to thank all of our panelists and our audience, and also everyone doing this work, often quietly but persistently. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for joining us. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada for inviting us to host a live podcast episode at ICAM. What you heard today reflects where our field is right now. We have the data, we have the stories, and increasingly we have the tools. The question now is, how do we use them? How do we build systems that are not just compliant, but are truly supportive, consistent, and designed for student success? To our panelists, thank you for your leadership, your honesty, and the work you're doing to push this field forward. And to our audience, whether you were in the room with us in Ottawa or you are listening from somewhere else in the world, thank you for your time and your commitment to this work. If this episode resonated with you, share it with a colleague, a learner, or a leader in your institution. These conversations are how change starts and how it spreads. Until next time, this is the Docs with Disabilities podcast. The opinions expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, their respective institutions, or their funders. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Non-Derivative license. This episode was produced by me, Lisa Meeks.